super lucky disaster man. Chapter 30. Who is more important, me or him? Komaeda Nagito looked at Dazai Osamu, who was waiting there, and revealed an expression of realization. So, this time, the luck was with Dazai-kun? Dazai Osamu pretended to think for a moment, perhaps it's misfortune. Ha ha ha. Komaeda Nagito laughed and said, I feel like it's luck. But for Dazai-kun to appear here like this, is it for work? Maybe there's a chance to see Dazai-kun in work mode. No matter how I think about it, that's luck. Dazai Osamu shrugged, leaned over, and stepped onto the last flight of stairs, with Komaeda Nagito stepping aside to make way for him. They walked side by side. That's right, the boss is here too, but right now it's break time. The old man from Tei Corporation was reviewing Komaeda Nagito's information, but since it wasn't the time for serious discussions, even spending time idly counted as rest. Ha, Boss Mori, pretending to say something like, let the young people go out and have fun, and sent him to find Komaeda Nagito. In reality, he just wanted to observe how they interact with each other. Dazai Osamu knew that Mori Ogai was actually hinting for him to take Komaeda Nagito to their VIP guest room. However, since Mori Ogai didn't explicitly say it, he could take his time, delay a bit on the way, and it wouldn't be an issue. This is the resting room set up for the winner, Dazai Osamu casually introduced to Komaeda Nagito. If you don't want to stay here, you can come with me to the room next door. Komaeda Nagito glanced around at the luxurious resting room. Unlike the room downstairs, which had nothing but a basic sofa and not even a cup of water, this resting room not only had a very comfortable-looking sofa but also a banquet-style long table, filled with various kinds of food and drinks. The people here were also different from the losers downstairs, who could only lick their wounds and avoid facing reality. Every person here was spirited and full of confidence, raising their glasses with glowing faces, complimenting each other on making it this far. The room was filled with an atmosphere of joy. At this moment, while they were chatting with each other, their attention wasn't actually focused on their conversation partners. Instead, they were secretly observing Dazai Osamu and Komaeda Nagito. They saw very clearly that this young man, dressed in a black suit with bandages wrapped around his head, was not one of the typical men in black suits and sunglasses from the Tei Corporation. As individuals from the lower rungs of society, some of them were quite familiar with the underworld, and when this young man first entered the room, the cold, dangerous aura surrounding him was immediately clear to those nearby. In an instant, they understood, he was different from them, and from the people of Tei. He belonged to that other world. The list of accomplishments over the years isn't necessarily reliable when it comes to the mafia. Those who can rise to prominence through cunning and schemes are often far more terrifying than those who steadily climb the ranks step by step. They dared to shout and bark orders at the men in sunglasses, showing off their arrogance, but they couldn't even bring themselves to make eye contact with this young man for more than 3 seconds. At that moment, they became very nervous, not knowing why someone like him had come to their lower-class resting room or what his intentions were. Even though they had all won, there was still a terrifying gulf between them and those important figures. They weren't even in the same league, not even allowed to be in the same room as them. Those important people were in another VIP room, laughing and watching the farce below. This room, which seemed prestigious on the surface, wasn't even worth the attention of those people. However, the sudden silence made things feel even more eerie. But since the newcomers' purpose clearly had nothing to do with them, they could only speak louder, clinking glasses with one another to stir up the atmosphere, trying to prevent the situation from descending into an awkward silence. Fortunately, it wasn't long before the oppressive atmosphere around that mafia-like young man suddenly eased. He opened his mouth and called out a name, and his tone even sounded rather cheerful. Everyone quietly memorized the pronunciation of that surname, deciding that in the future, they would stay far away from people like him. The person who approached was a young man with fluffy, loose white hair. Coming up from that kind of place indicated that this young man named Komaeda, like them, was a participant in the game downstairs. However, no one here truly felt that they were the same. Because this young man named Komaida had a badge on his chest displaying over a dozen stars, a simple tally that practically made it seem like he hadn't lost at all. Even those who had been through this multiple times had never seen such a terrifying record. What could that mean? This meant that either this young man Komaida was incredibly skilled at manipulating people's minds, or his luck was absolutely unbeatable. As for cheating, some people, having participated in the game several times, had thoroughly figured out its rules, but there weren't many ways to cheat. Unless you bribed the referees, no amount of cheating could win you that many stars. So, it had to be one of the first two possibilities. And whichever one it was, both were the kind of traits that gamblers both revere and fear. The gamblers exchanged glances, trying to communicate their thoughts. What's the relationship between those two? He's dressed so extravagantly, why would he come to a place like this? Did he bribe the referees? It doesn't seem like he recognizes anyone here, so maybe he didn't cheat. The surname Komaida sounds familiar, why can't I remember where it's from? In truth, exchanging glances was quite difficult, they were all speaking past each other. They just saw that others were smiling and playing along, so the atmosphere fell into place. Whether or not they correctly understood each other's looks was a different matter. They quietly listened to these two youths, much younger than them, whose circumstances were entirely different, talking to each other. They initially thought it had nothing to do with them, but as the conversation went on, the two's gazes suddenly fell on them. Everyone's expressions became somewhat stiff, yet they tried to maintain an air of indifference. Life was indeed tough. Their little thoughts were almost transparent in Komaida Nagito's eyes. As a result, Komaida Nagito, now disinterested, shifted his gaze away. No. If the ones downstairs are the trash among trash, then they are just slightly better recycled garbage. Komaida Nagito said in a harsh tone. In the end, it's just about clearing debts. They are still at the very bottom of society. Rising again to create a new life requires willpower and action, and from this crowd, I don't see even the slightest trace of that. They are clearly just trash, yet they get conceited because they've beaten worse trash. They think that now they're somehow different from the garbage they once were, completely overestimating themselves. With those words, the room, which had been filled with joyful chatter, instantly fell into a frozen silence. Only Dazai-Osamu wasn't bothered by the harshness of the words. In fact, he even clapped for Komaida Nagito, well said. Though, Komaida-kun, I didn't expect you to have such a sharp tongue, what a rare sight. A sharp tongue. Komaida Nagito's attitude softened considerably as he turned to talk to Dazai-Osamu. I was just speaking the truth. Besides, Dazai-kun is so amazing, completely different from this trash. How could I possibly use that kind of attitude toward you? Well, I'm truly honored then, Dazai-Osamu smiled. If you're not interested in the people here, come with me inside. With that, Dazai-Osamu led Komaida Nagito out of the room, leaving behind a silent resting lounge. The man from Tei Corporation, responsible for maintaining order, looked at the crowd who no longer seemed to be in a celebratory mood and sympathetically adjusted his sunglasses. Suddenly, someone spoke up, wait. I think I remember where I've heard the name Komaida before. I think I remember too. Another person asked with a strange expression, just to confirm, did you used to work in insurance? Yes. The two former insurance workers exchanged glances, both showing expressions of recognition and unease. The others, hearing this cryptic yet seemingly significant conversation, grew curious and couldn't help but ask what was going on. The atmosphere quickly became lively again. Let me start from the beginning. Do you know that Tei Corporation has an insurance company? Over there, they've got a real troublemaker whose last name is pronounced Komaida. Komaida Nagito and Dazai-Osamu had no idea that after they left, the people who had just been rendered expressionless by their words immediately perked up and started gossiping. If they had known, they likely would have only thought that this group was even more hopeless. In reality, these people didn't even leave any impression in their minds. After exiting the door of this resting room, they found themselves in a hallway. As they walked, Dazai-Osamu tilted his head slightly, looking toward Komaeda Nagito, and asked, "By the way, Komaeda-kun, did you come here through some sort of deal with the people from Tei Corporation? What made you think of coming to a place like this?" Komaeda Nagito smiled naturally and replied, "I'm searching for hope." "Hope? In a place like this?" Dazai-Osamu raised an eyebrow. "That's right. I just thought that in a place filled with despair, there might be a chance for a brilliant hope to be born. But this place is not what I imagined." Komaeda Nagito sighed. This level of despair is nowhere near enough to become the fertile ground for hope. Trash is still trash, and garbage is still garbage. I want to see something deeper, a more intense and overwhelming despair, not this trivial, petty chaos. Dazai-Osamu thought to himself, considering that Komaeda Nagito, who had witnessed his parents being crushed to death by a meteorite right in front of him, likely had expectations for grander circumstances. Satisfying his desire for such an experience through Tei Corporation alone might indeed be a bit difficult. "Komaeda-kun, why are you so obsessed with seeing hope?" Dazai-Osamu already had a vague idea of the answer in his mind, but seeing Komaeda Nagito in this state, he felt it necessary to confirm. "Why?" Komaeda Nagito looked at Dazai-Osamu with confusion. "Isn't pursuing hope the most natural thing?" "That's not necessarily the case." Dazai-Osamu smiled and said, "In the end, hope is just like ideals, nothing more than a vague concept. When people say they are pursuing an ideal, they aren't chasing some abstract word, but rather something that represents that ideal. For example, my ideal is to revive my family, or my ideal is to become president." As he spoke, Dazai-Osamu watched Komaeda Nagito closely, trying to catch any small change in his expression. "So, Komaeda-kun, when you talk about pursuing hope, what specific thing does that hope represent?" Dazai-Osamu wasn't surprised by Komaeda Nagito's silence. He had once used an eavesdropping devices on Kudo Shinichi and listened in on Komaeda Nagito's definition of hope. No matter how many times despair devours it, it will not disappear, it's unchangeable, it's an absolute good thing. But this was still just a concept, not something tangible. What Dazai-Osamu wanted to know now was whether Komaeda Nagito himself understood the true reason behind his pursuit of hope. Komaeda Nagito took a while to respond, and his once clear gaze gradually became more muddled. "It's just that, even if you don't put it into specific words, doesn't everyone already know? All kinds of messages have always taught us, full of hope, so, something that won't change even when struck by despair is worth pursuing, right?" No one had ever asked Komaeda Nagito this question before. In his previous world, hope was an unspoken and universally understood concept. Children are hope, talented individuals are the world's hope. These kinds of messages constantly appeared. Growing up in such an environment, Komaeda Nagito naturally accepted this logic. Hope was an absolute good thing, and no one would question or pursue the specifics behind it. In this kind of environment, where there was a fanatical reverence for hope, Komaeda Nagito lost the ability to clearly distinguish between what part of his belief was his own will and what part was shaped by the environment. When had he started chasing hope, wanting to witness hope with his own eyes? Why had he become so obsessed with hope? Komaeda Nagito no longer remember. Dazai-Osamu observed Komaeda Nagito's expression and seemed to come to a realization. He interrupted the topic, "If you can't figure it out, don't force yourself to. Sometimes, the more you try to recall, the further you get away from the answer. Dazai-kun, you're actually willing to have such a deep conversation with me. You're so kind," Komaeda Nagito couldn't help but remark. Dazai-Osamu. Even Dazai-Osamu sometimes couldn't quite grasp Komaeda Nagito's train of thought. At the very least, he didn't think that his earlier intense questioning had anything to do with being kind. Yet, Komaeda Nagito's fondness for Dazai-Osamu had now grown even stronger. From their previous conversation, Komaeda Nagito clearly understood that Dazai-Osamu had no interest in hope. But that wasn't Dazai-kun's fault. Komaeda Nagito thought to himself. It's because, as Dazai-kun said, people aren't interested in vague, abstract concepts. They have too many things demanding their attention, more concrete, tangible goals they can pursue, which, in itself, is actually a manifestation of being filled with hope. However, in his previous world, whenever others faced his explanations and discussions about hope, they only showed expressions of disgust, telling him to stop talking about strange things. But Dazai-kun was different. Dazai-kun seriously listened, clearly gave it thought, and even proactively expressed the parts he didn't understand. To Komaeda, this was a rare kind of feedback. It was only just now that Komaeda Nagito realized where the problem had been all along with his preaching, and he resolved to make improvements. If the reason was that his abstract concepts were too vague to resonate with others, he could compensate by using more concrete examples. So, if he could recall the initial reason for his longing for hope, he should be able to make his arguments more convincing and avoid getting stuck when someone like Dazai-kun asks a question. However, what Dazai-kun said makes sense. For something so distant, forcing yourself to think about it might only make it harder to recall. It's better to slowly remember it later, just keeping it in mind for now. Dazai-osamu had no idea that, unintentionally, he had increased Komaeda Nagito's fondness for him. He was simply guiding him, like a tour guide, introducing things to Komaeda Nagito. This here is the banquet hall. Komaeda Nagito then asked, is Dazai-kun's boss here? No, we need to take a different route for that. This area is for the guests invited by the president of Tei Corporation, Dazai-osamu explained matter-of-factly. It's rare to have some time to relax, so I don't want to return too quickly. Taking the long way around is a good way to unwind. A man in black sunglasses, looking as if he had been mass-produced by Tei Corporation, respectfully opened the door for them. Immediately, the lively sound of people chatting came through. If one ignored the performances happening in the hall below, which showcased the acting of the people from the lower rungs of society, this place suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a typical high-class gathering. Inside the fragrant atmosphere of elegance, everyone was dressed in luxurious and extravagant formal attire, exuding endless grace as they moved through the crowd. Holding their glasses of wine was not necessarily for drinking, even though the wine inside was worth a month's effort of an ordinary worker's salary, yet they did not care at all. It seemed as though it was merely an ornament, a prop to start a conversation. As soon as the door opened, a certain someone who was doing secret work, extremely sensitive to changes in their surroundings, instinctively glanced towards the door. After that, he froze in place without saying a word, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to describe his feelings. In front of Komaeda Nagito, he appeared to possess two identities, a folklorist and a detective. Under the alias Amuro Toru, a member of the Japanese police, he silently screamed in his heart. Komaeda-kun, why are you here? Perhaps due to being sensitive to gazes, Port Mafia's executive candidate Dazai-osamu was the first to notice Amuro Toru's gaze. After glancing directly at him, Dazai-osamu smiled and said something to Komaeda Nagito, who was standing beside him. Amuro Toru thought to himself, this isn't good. The main purpose of his visit to this place was a certain important figure at this banquet. Carrying out the mission quietly was his original intention. If those two approached him, he felt things would become a bit troublesome. The more Amuro Toru hoped something not to happen, the more likely that something will happen. Sure enough, in the next moment, hearing what Dazai-osamu told him, Komaeda Nagito immediately began smiling and waving toward Amuro Toru. Amuro Toru sighed deeply in his heart. Don't be fooled by the fact that he had been at this banquet hall for quite some time. In truth, he barely paid attention to anything going on. As a member of the police, he had absolutely no interest in this kind of game that exposes the dark side of human nature, and even found it disgusting. Whenever he saw it, his mind would be filled with thoughts of how Tei Corporation was pulling such underhanded tricks, yet due to the entanglement of various forces, they couldn't be apprehended directly. Then, he'd only end up getting frustrated with himself, so it was better to just turn a blind eye. However, the banquet hall's broadcast screen and the rooms for distinguished guests were different, and Komaeda Nagito didn't appear much on the main screen. Amuro Toru wasn't paying attention to the lower floor, focused on his mission, so he naturally didn't expect this current situation to occur. In the banquet's grand hall, the upper-class individuals were all dressed formally, and suddenly a casually dressed Komaeda Nagito appeared, along with a slightly dangerous-looking Dazai Osamu, standing out quite a bit. However, everyone present had seen major events in life, held power in their hands, and thus did not panic. They weren't as nervous as those previous game winners, and though they found it strange, they took a glance and then ignored it. Furthermore, due to their level of refinement, they wouldn't keep staring incessantly. Because of this, Komaeda Nagito and Dazai Osamu moved through the crowd in the calm atmosphere and arrived at Amuro Toru's corner. Komaeda-kun, Amuro Toru greeted him with a complex expression, and this person. Dazai Osamu said. You're the Amuro who brought the cat-transformed Komaeda-kun over, right? We've already chatted over the phone. Amuro Toru wasn't surprised that he had been recognized. Perhaps he had been monitoring the Port Mafia's headquarters cameras, or maybe it was just a random guess, or perhaps there were simply too many possibilities. If he went to the Port Mafia's headquarters, he never intended to fully conceal his tracks. Therefore, he had already released some specific intelligence to deal with other people's investigations. It's me. I didn't expect to see you here, Dazai-kun. Amuro Toru pretended to be unaware of the intelligence talks between the Port Mafia and the Tei Corporation taking place on this ship, putting on a look of surprise. Did you bring Komaeda-kun here to have some fun? Dazai Osamu immediately perked up. Not at all. I'm just as surprised to see Komaeda-kun here. If Komaeda-kun wanted, how could I not help him if he just told me? Komaeda Nagito smiled awkwardly and said, how could I shamelessly bother Dazai-kun? Besides, I didn't even know Dazai-kun would be here. But actually, Amuro-san. Amuro Toru saw the expression on Komaeda Nagito's face, full of, you're the one who's really out of place here, and couldn't help but cough lightly. He quickly brought up the excuse he had prepared in advance. Well, I'm a detective, aren't I? I came here because there's something I want to investigate. This excuse was something Komaeda Nagito could accept, but it wouldn't fool Dazai Osamu. At least after Amuro Toru finished speaking, he glanced at that young man who could one day become the future crime boss of Yokohama, Dazai Osamu, a prospective executive candidate of the Port Mafia, and noticed that the other was looking at him with an expression of clear understanding. Dazai Osamu smiled faintly and said, to be able to get an invitation to this ship, Detective-san really has extraordinary abilities. There was clearly an underlying meaning to his words, but Komaeda Nagito ignored the hidden implications, directly agreeing, yes, I also think Amuro-san is very talented, whether in folklore studies, detective work, or in other areas. I hope Amuro-san can continue to excel in his areas of expertise. This guy. Amuro Toru couldn't help but glance at Komaeda Nagito and helplessly realized that with his many suspicious behavior, Komaeda Nagito probably had noticed it before but simply didn't care, as long as the parts he was interested in seemed fine. This kind of personality is really dangerous, especially when he's mingling with the mafia. Unfortunately, he wasn't in a position to say anything, as Komaeda Nagito wasn't someone close to him. He could only hope the kid knew what he was doing and wouldn't stray down the wrong path. Amuro Toru took a deep breath, still maintaining a smile, and found the most convenient way to deal with Komaeda Nagito. If I may ask, Komaeda-kun, could you help me with something right now? My mission requires me to keep a low profile. Komaeda Nagito immediately understood, though it's a pity I won't get to see Amuro-san at work, I'll take my leave then. True to his word, Komaeda Nagito promptly turned around, ready to leave, but as soon as he took a step, he realized Dazai Osamu was still standing in place, looking at Amuro Toru. Dazai-kun? He tugged lightly on Dazai Osamu's coat sleeve, reminding him, we shouldn't disturb Amuro-san's work right now, should we? If it's not something particularly important, we can talk about it later. Dazai-Osamu's expression became somewhat subtle, but he didn't say anything, and simply followed Komaeda Nagito as they left. As if being divinely assisted, Amuro Toru raised an eyebrow, and his previously heavy mood finally lightened considerably, even making him smile naturally. After passing through the banquet hall and exiting through another door into the hallway, Dazai-Osamu couldn't hold back any longer and spoke. "Let me ask something. Although I really hate to admit it, that guy Chuya fits your standard of a talented person, doesn't he?" "Nakahara-san. Of course." Komaeda Nagito answered without hesitation. Dazai-Osamu pondered for a moment. "So, if there were something important that required choosing a capable person, and the final vote was in your hands, would you choose me or Chuya?" Komaeda Nagito immediately responded, "How could someone as ordinary and incompetent as me be qualified to judge between two such great people like you? Of course, I'd decline to vote." Dazai-Osamu. There was no need to say anything further. Even though the reason sounded reasonable, what he wanted to know had already been confirmed. Komaeda Nagito's attitude toward Amuro Toru earlier gave him a subtle feeling, and now after testing it a bit. Clearly, they had only met once, and Chuya even openly say in front of Komaeda about whether or not to kill him. Yet despite such suffocating behavior from Chuya, in Komaeda Nagito's mind, their importance is somehow on the same level. They've only met once. He couldn't swallow this indignation. Chapter 30 End.